Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to LVS Perspectives. Today we welcome Fredi to our school from Voicebox.
Yeah.
Welcome to our school, and I know you've been working with our pupils this week, haven't you?
Yes.
Including today.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be looking at promoting healthy masculinity, and I know Fredi's got a fantastic presentation for you.
Yeah.
And as usual, if you've got any questions for us, please either put them in the chat, or I do have my email open on my phone here, so I can pick up any questions that you might have as well. So Fredi, I'm going to leave it all over to you now.
Brilliant.
To tell us all about what the wonderful work you're doing.
Great, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so as mentioned, we've been working with the students here at LVS this week. We run some assemblies earlier in the week, we run some workshops today. And what we're going to be looking at today is sort of questions about what does it mean to be a man. So that's the sort of work that we do at Voicebox. We promote healthy masculinity with young people and in organisations. So we're going to be looking at what does it mean to be a man, why this question is relevant, why it's critical as well, and how we as parents and society can sort of navigate that question and how we can engage the young people and our children on these issues in effective and sort of meaningful ways as well. So in terms of kind of being a man, you know, it's always important for us to basically ask ourselves, what do we think it means to be a man? So, you know, what qualities do we expect in men? And whenever we're working with young people, we always ask them this question: what qualities do you expect in men? And what are those qualities? So, for example, you know, often the things that come up, and the things that came up today, a lot of them were things around sort of strength, toughness, resilience, self-reliance, those sorts of ideas. And then there are lots of different ideas as well. We also tend to ask as well in our workshops, you know, what do you think being a woman means, etc. So exploring gender stereotypes from both sides. This is important because, you know, even I who do this work day in, day out, often find that I have some unarticulated ideas about what a man is. You know, I was recently asked, one of our facilitators is doing a PhD in masculinity, and he's doing some research for that, and he asked me to do some of the research with him and kind of be an interviewee for it. And he asked me, what do you think it means to be a man? And I realised I hadn't actually asked myself that question in a very long time. And it's something that I needed to interrogate and have interrogated over time, but you know, it's impacted my mental health. The way I approach work as well is definitely related to it. Family, those sorts of things. So we need to be aware of our own assumptions of what masculinity looks like before we start kind of thinking about what maybe young people think masculinity is, those sorts of things. So yeah, self-reflection is crucial for this work. And in terms of, you know, why is this question still relevant in 2024? One of the big things that's happening at the moment in our sort of society is that over time, you know, the meaning of womanhood, the opportunities available to women have evolved thanks to the incredible work of sort of feminism, the feminist movement over the last 50, 60 years. And in the 1960s and 70s, you know, in the decades before that, you know, women were given a script that told them to fit into a neat box, labeled sort of mother, wife, etc. There was quite a limiting view of what femininity was, of what women were, etc. And movements since have challenged those ideas, demanding more opportunities, more respect, more equality, but also a reimagining of what our society sees women as, and sees women as being able to be, do, look like, act like, etc. And this led to legislative change as well, you know, in terms of kind of the Equal Pay Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, all of these sorts of things. And so the stories and media for young girls today has changed over time because our ideas of what womanhood means have changed over time. So, you know, if we look at, for example, these kind of early Disney films from a long time ago, the ideas of what a woman coming through in these films around domesticity, you know, being passive, submissive, need rescuing, not independent, etc. And if we look at, say, for example, the ones that have come out more recently, you know, we have different ideas of love outside of romantic love, independence, athleticism, leadership, etc. The ideas that we are linking to kind of womanhood have changed over time, and that's definitely something that's been massively beneficial for women, for our society in general as well. And so these messages have changed. It's also important to make a special mention as well to Turning Red, which is one of the first kind of major animated family films, you know, showing kind of period products and normalizing those sorts of issues as well, menstruation, etc. And while this is brilliant, it kind of takes me on to my next point, which is that there's clearly a long way to go. You know, there's still lots of stigma, there's still a gender pay gap. We still have a lot of work to do. We've been doing it for a long time, and we have a long way to go with it as well. while there's undeniable progress, this work isn't over. There are still many issues around, particularly sexual violence, particularly in the workplace, safety, etc. There's still a lot of work to do, and particularly with misogyny as well happening at the moment. And so this leads me on to kind of evolution of masculinity. So what does it mean to be a man today? It's kind of a big question that as a society we're grappling with at the moment. What does it mean to be a man today? And why is this question important today? Well, because as women's roles have shifted, men's roles also need to evolve. And part of what's happened at the moment is that we haven't gone through a process of men's roles, and the idea of what masculinity is, the idea of what manhood is, hasn't changed in pace with the rest of our society changing, with ideas of womanhood changing, with ideas of gender equality changing, etc. And so what that happens is that that's kind of left masculinity in this sort of flux period where actually we need to interrogate it. Maybe that work hasn't happened yet, and that's part of what we're now starting to grapple with as a society. Now, it's also important to note at this point that it's not just about kind of updating the ideas of manhood for the sake of it. Part of the issue with masculinity at the moment is that it's linked to a lot of these issues around maleness and a lot of these issues that boys and men are experiencing at the moment. So, for example, they're starting to fall behind in educational attainment at GCSEs. There's less boys going to universities than there are girls. There's issues around health, physical health, mental health, suicide statistics as well. So there are lots of issues that are affecting men and boys at the moment that are linked to ideas of manhood, but there are also just issues that are affecting men and boys that we need to sort of we need to be paying attention to. So, I'm sure many of us know that the suicide statistics, that it's the biggest killer in men under 50. It's also 75% of suicides in this country are male, etc. So, men are nearly 3 times more likely as well to become alcohol dependent. Boys are less likely to go to university. And men on average as well live between 3 and 4 years less than women do, which I always find staggering that it's not something that we're really kind of taking more notice of, that actually we just live less years. We spend less time on this planet with the people that we love. So there are a lot of issues that are related to men and boys issues. Again, it's not to say that we shouldn't be focusing on the issues affecting women and girls. And in fact, in a second, we'll go into how those are linked, and that it's not a zero-sum game. It's about working with everybody for everybody. And so these stats, they tell a clear story that many boys, many men are struggling. The issues are complex, but one thing is certain, that if we want to prevent these issues and improve boys' outcomes, we need to question and reshape the messages that we're getting as a society about masculinity. And so, as mentioned, it's not about sidelining the struggles of women or ignoring the ongoing fight for gender equality. It's quite the opposite, that actually this work is work that is going to benefit everybody. So by helping young men and boys critically reflect on masculinity, we're also addressing some of the harmful behaviours, some of the harmful attitudes, like harassment, misogyny, etc., which affect women and girls. And so some of the central ideas, traditional ideas of masculinity that we may have about sort of men being the decision maker, men having sex with women to demonstrate masculinity, men not being feminine, men suppressing their emotions, and men maybe being accepting of aggression and violence. Those ideas that are within traditional ideas of masculinity are also quite closely linked to either accepting or perpetrating sexual violence against women and girls, etc. So it's a really nice example of where engaging with this question of masculinity, promoting a healthier version of masculinity, benefits everybody, not just men and boys, but also women and girls as well. So it's something that benefits everybody. And so this leads us on to kind of how we as parents and society navigate this question. It's important to understand the current narratives and stories around boyhood, men, masculinity in 2024. So the first one is around sort of ideas of traditional masculinity. And these are the kinds of ideas that are in the background of a lot of our brains, in the background of our society. So these are things like men should always appear strong, never show weakness, never back down or show fear, be confident, outspoken, act like you don't care or try hard, be successful, be a leader and take charge, avoid showing too much emotion like sadness, don't be like a girl, be sexually proficient, so sort of a player or have power over women as well. And being risk taker, that's a crucial one, particularly for adolescent boys. Being a risk taker is quite a big factor in all of this. And so boys and young men often feel pressure to embody a lot of these qualities to sort of gain acceptance and avoid judgment within their peer group. And that actually creates a burden on boys, and they call it the burden of masculinity, to reach these impossible standards. Right? No human being can ever be all of these things 100% of the time. Some of these are harmful in and of themselves. Some of them, it's more the rigidity, it's more the need to be living up to these ideas that causes some of the stress, the harm associated with masculinity. And these traditional norms can limit boys' expression. And so in relationships, we can see how these norms might impede a boy's ability to develop meaningful connections. If we need to avoid showing too much emotion, we might not be able to show vulnerability, which means we might not be able to engage with people on a level where we're able to express vulnerability, get help with our issues, which builds trust and builds meaningful connection, etc. So these things, they impact a lot of different areas of men and boys' lives: mental health, relationships, friendships, all of these sorts of areas. And so what's important as well at this point to acknowledge is ICS. We've been looking a lot at ICS as an organisation recently, because they're a really interesting area where a lot of these rules come up. A lot of these rules are present in these ideas. I don't know if anybody's heard young people talking about ICS, but essentially they are sort of, well, we'll see in the videos, but they are basically, they're a way for young people to express something that they don't like, or something that turns them off, or something that they find unattractive. And a lot of the time they're not just random quirks, they're actually tied to sort of deeper ideas about what's considered normal or acceptable behaviour for men and women.
More icky than watching a guy walk out of Starbucks with a Frappuccino in his hand, like sipping on his green straw. Oh my gosh. Order a black Americano like a man.
Example of a man who's on Instagram, and he's gone through and he's written a list of all of the things that are seen as ICS, and you can see there's 584 of them now. Now that one's quite a clear example. It's quite a clear example of a sort of gender idea being policed. She even says, order a black Americano like a man. So there's that going on there. Now, in terms of these ICS are telling us quite a bit about kind of the expectations of how men and how are supposed to behave. So the idea of kind of black Americano being masculine might be tied to ideas of kind of men not looking for frills or not being kind of fancy or those sorts of things. Now, this is a really nice example that ties into kind of risk-taking, things like that.
You look so dumb right now.
So again, this is seen as a ick, right? Wearing a helmet, being concerned with your safety, is seen as an ick. So what's actually happening here? What's really going on when somebody says that they get the ick from a guy wearing a bike helmet? Well, it's a reinforcement of the idea that men should be fearless, invulnerable, reckless, etc. That taking risks or avoiding protective gear proves their toughness. And there's this unspoken message that real men don't need protection, right? If you care about your safety, you're less of a man, etc. And the crucial idea here is that these ideas, they're not just ideas. These play out in our society in real life and have real life impacts. So they have real life consequences. Right? Men are far more likely to engage in risk-taking behaviours, just statistically, full stop. Take driving. Men are more likely to engage in risky driving practice, such as speeding, drunk driving, not wearing seat belts, etc. Men are far more likely to be involved in serious road accidents as well. 75% of road fatalities were male. And there are many factors contributing to these statistics. As with anything about gender, there's a delicate interplay between kind of the bio and the psycho and the social as well, the biopsychosocial model. So some of it might be to do with biological factors like testosterone or differences in biology. Some of it's to do with the psychological things that come from growing up as a boy and learning how to be a boy, and some of it's to do with the social in terms of the kind of gendered ideas, etc. But the research shows us that men who strongly identify with stereotypical norms of masculinity, like taking risks, being tough, are much more likely to engage in behaviours like risky driving. So that the ideas of masculinity have an impact on people's behaviours and attitudes as well later on down the line. So this light-hearted ick about wearing a helmet taps into a much larger message that pressures men to take risks to prove their masculinity, and it has real-life consequences. We also have this example as well, which I'll just let you listen to.
Like when they
No. Okay.
Say it. Say
No.
it. Run it.
That was so mean. I was gonna say if they're like really nice, it's such an ick.
So again, what's going on here, right? What's going on when somebody says they get the ick from a guy being nice? There's maybe this idea that men should be assertive, dominant, emotionally distant, emotionally unexpressive, and being too kind or caring makes it seem less masculine. So there's sort of this bad boy stereotype, right? Men should be a little cold or hard to get or even indifferent to be more desirable. Being a guy being really nice is breaking another of these unwritten rules, okay? And this idea, how does this impact relationships? Well, it impacts relationships in that, when being too nice gives someone it promotes the idea that kindness or emotional openness isn't attractive. And this can encourage boys to suppress their feelings and avoid being vulnerable because they fear being seen as weak, right? And over time, this can lead to unhealthy dynamics in relationships where boys might treat girls with less respect or avoid emotional intimacy in an attempt to appear more masculine. And so it can seem like harmless jokes, but they can actually reinforce outdated gender norms, keeping us sort of stuck in the same limiting expectations, basically. And these are just some of the clear examples of how these traditional ideas still show up and are still expected today. Particularly ideas around self-reliance and emotional control are very closely linked to poor mental health, suicidality, and potentially even completed suicide as well in men who have those ideas. So these ideas have real life consequences for people, and it's part of why we do the work we do at Voicebox, is to challenge these ideas, help young people become aware of them so that we can challenge the harmful impact that this has on their lives and everybody else's lives as well. And so traditional masculinity is one of the sort of stories we tell boys today about masculinity. This one often is in the background. It's often kind of subconscious. It's often something that's embedded in all of our brains. It's not necessarily something that we may be doing always actively, but it's in a lot of the sort of subconscious way that we relate to each other. The second story is obviously about sort of toxic masculinity, right? This is another narrative that we hear about masculinity. And this is a critique of traditional ideas of masculinity as harmful, but it's a sort of, become a difficult and an unproductive aspect of it. So, if we unpack the word toxic, the toxic means, poisonous or very harmful. And if we're a young boy or a young man, having this word kind of tied to our identity, I can definitely understand how that makes them feel defensive or shamed or not want to engage in this conversation because it feels like, well, you're just telling me I'm bad, I'm toxic, I'm etc. And so, we speak to a lot of boys and young men and they often tell us that they feel frustrated or angry or unheard, ashamed, disengaged, defensive, and like something is wrong with them. They feel blamed, confused, hard done by, all of these different things in terms of when they hear the phrase toxic masculinity, which is part of why a lot of the people in the men and masculinities field have moved away from using that term because it is just unproductive in our conversations with young people. It doesn't create openness, it doesn't create curiosity, rather defensiveness, and it sort of further entrenches people. Now, this isn't to say that poor behaviours shouldn't be addressed and we shouldn't hold people accountable for poor behaviours. But that branding masculinity as toxic can be counterproductive just because of the way that conversation's been had. And so, many boys do experience a kind of burden of masculinity as they try and fail to reach these impossible standards of traditional masculinity. And so for the thing they feel pressure to work towards, then be labelled as toxic, can often be confusing, frustrating, and leave them feeling a little bit hopeless. Well, I'm trying to achieve this thing. You're telling me it's wrong. So what's the alternative? I don't know what else I'm meant to be doing, basically. And that's part of what we're looking to provide at Voicebox, is some of that alternative. And so we need to be careful about using the term so flippantly, as it can affect not only how boys view themselves and each other, but also how girls see boys, how we as educators, how we as parents see boys as well. So it's not necessarily productive for us to view masculinity in young boys through a prism of kind of toxic masculinity, basically. And so we have traditional ideas of masculinity. We also have this idea of toxic masculinity as well. One of the other kind of narratives around masculinity is around sort of ideas of male privilege. Now, while it's essential to acknowledge the privilege and that men and boys do hold in certain aspects of their lives, and the need for diverse voices and the discrimination and oppression of their identities still experienced on a day-to-day basis, this message, when we're trying to engage people in a conversation about masculinity, can become problematic when it's presented without nuance. And so, especially for boys and young men whose lived experiences may not necessarily align with a lot of these ideas of privilege. then that might be a difficult conversation for them to have. Now, in many aspects of our world, men do hold privilege, in the workplace, in the amount of men in leadership positions, the gender pay gap, in areas of sort of domestic labour, all of these sorts of ways. There are lots of ways in which men hold a lot of privilege, safety on the streets, those sorts of things. But in some other ways, as we've established, many men and boys are struggling. So to label all men as privileged, and therefore as having very little problems that we should listen to, can be counterproductive. Many commentators have linked this even to the recent election results in the US, where many men maybe felt unseen, unheard by a Democratic Party. And obviously we won't go into that too much, but there is a need for nuance in understanding the ways in which male privilege functions. In some ways, in the workplace, in the outside world, there is a lot of privilege for men, and sometimes in the kind of internal world, in the relational world, in the emotional sphere, there's actually a level of kind of underprivilegedness there in some areas as well. And so for a boy whose daily reality includes maybe suffering and some challenges, being told he's privileged can feel invalidating, basically. If he's experiencing hardship, whether it be mental health issues, loneliness, difficulties at home, family instability, limited opportunities, he's kind of constantly told he's sort of part of the problem, he's a privileged male, he may feel unseen and unheard. And sometimes, often, I do see this conversation had in a way where it is slightly used to sort of silence people when they come up with, well, what about this, what about that, etc. We need to listen to those problems rather than shut them down. And so this kind of messaging risks alienating young men, sort of reinforcing a perception that their struggles, maybe don't matter, or they're not worthy of empathy, because we view everybody else as having it worse than them as well. And so when boys feel as though their challenges aren't acknowledged, they might react defensively or just completely withdraw from the conversations. Rather than seeing themselves as potential allies in the fight for equality, they may become resentful, feeling unfairly blamed for problems they maybe didn't create. And in the worst cases, it can even push them boys towards feeling hostile to social justice or the fight for gender equality, because they perceive these issues as dismissive of their own reality, and can be a factor in pushing boys towards sort of online radicalisation, etc. And so it's important for us to see boys as allies, not necessarily part of the problem. So, we need empathy within this. Empathy has to be a key cornerstone of having these conversations with young boys. We can acknowledge that privilege exists without diminishing the very real struggles boys and young men face. And by recognising their hardships alongside discussions of privilege, we can make space for them to feel seen and valued, and actually that engages them back in these conversations. And when we take this approach, we're sending a clear message. Your experiences matter, your voice is important, and you too can play a positive role in creating a more just and sort of equitable society, and one that's better for everybody involved. And so we've got traditional masculinity, toxic masculinity, male privilege. And then one other kind of narrative that now has been thrown in the mix, as if three bits to this isn't enough. We've also got this idea of progressive masculinity as well, which includes emotional openness, support for feminism, growing awareness of gender-based violence and activism, belief in gender equality, etc. It champions values like this. And often these ideas, part of the potential problem with progressive masculinity is if we replace, while these qualities are positive, if we replace one rigid set of expectations with another, boys might still face limitations on expression, a burden to live up to rigid ideas of masculinity. And so often these ideas can be slightly like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? Jettisoning anything that even hints at traditional masculinity, rather than taking some of the best aspects of traditional masculinity and traditional ideas and making them more flexible, more appropriate for 21st century living. For example, strength, being a protector, potentially even being a breadwinner. Those aren't harmful ideas. It's the rigidity. If all you can ever be is strong and you've got depression or you're grieving, etc., then that becomes a problem. If your partner also wants to be the breadwinner and you're rigidly saying, no, I must be the breadwinner, I can't have my partner being the breadwinner, then it becomes a problem. So it's more about the rigidity with a lot of these ideas. And when we do that, we can regain some of the nuance in the conversation about masculinity. And so traditional qualities like strength, resilience, they're positives, they're essential, especially for navigating today's world and supporting gender equality. So we must encourage boys to find a masculinity that's right for them, rather than necessarily imposing a one-size-fits-all approach. So these are just some of the ideas, right, that are going on about masculinity at the minute. It's obviously, we're thinking a lot about this as a society. There aren't necessarily very many clear answers, and a lot of young people get that. A lot of young people are feeling confused, etc. So with these mixed messages, many boys might feel lost, and if we as adults aren't having conversations to address this feeling of confusion, then young people might end up absorbing messaging that's not necessarily productive to their well-being, and that might So if we don't have these conversations with young people, because young people have a lot of questions about what it means to be a man today. I know I do as an adult. I know a lot of the adults in my life do, let alone young people who've got all these other questions about identity. And if we don't answer those questions and we don't engage in those conversations, they'll go online, they'll try and find answers online, and often those answers aren't answers that we want them to be getting. It's messaging that maybe isn't positive for their well-being. And so, if someone innocently puts in a search term like how to be a man, how to be successful, right? The social media algorithm gets to work. 10 videos later, they're consuming harmful content that tells them that women are to blame, society is to blame, all these sorts of things. There was research recently done between UCL, the University of Kent, and the Association of School and College Leaders, where they did a TikTok modelling study, and they found a 4-fold increase in the level of misogynistic content in the For You page of TikTok, so where it suggests ideas for you, over just 5 days on the platform. So in just 5 days, they had a 4-fold increase in the level of kind of misogynistic content. So if we're not answering these questions and our young people are looking online for the answers, often the answers they get aren't answers that are going to be beneficial for them. And so these influencers exploit young men's frustrations and confusion, offering simple, regressive answers that appeal to a desire for clarity and certainty. And as is often the case with exploitation, they're very good at understanding the very real pain that is being experienced. Boys feel lost and attacked. They don't feel like the rest of society is giving them a good enough solution. And so for some boys and men, these influences are giving them a solution. And if we don't address that pain ourselves, then we leave it ripe for exploitation. So how do we move forward? It's clear that our current stories and approaches aren't necessarily working. Boys need guidance, empathy, and room for self-reflection, not blame or rigid expectations. And so as parents and mentors, we have the opportunity to offer boys a broader perspective on masculinity, to help them understand and question societal norms without judgment, and to empower them shape a masculinity that works for them and for our society as a whole. So what's next? Well, how do we engage boys in productive conversations? Well, the method that we take at Voicebox is a sort of 3-part method. It's about understanding gender, exploring personal identity, and then redefining masculinity. So the first step in understanding gender is about awareness and critical thinking. So we help students identify the subtle and overt messages that they've received from media, family, culture, that shape their understanding of gender and of masculinity. And these societal norms often go unchallenged, and even we're unaware of them often, that these are ideas that are in our brains. But they have a powerful influence on our identity, behaviours, attitudes. And so our goal here is not just to build awareness, but also to critically examine these messages. So we need to help young people develop the skills to question and analyse these norms. So for example, this idea of strength. When is that beneficial? When is that not beneficial? And asking whether these expectations align with who they truly want to be, which is why we can move on to exploring personal identity, and if they're conducive to their well-being and the well-being of others. And so by recognising that these expectations aren't inherent truths, but sort of ideas that we've absorbed from our society, students can take agency over their identity, empowering them to break free from sort of passively accepting some of these norms. We then move into an exploration of personal values, and this is about empowerment, it's about agency. Now that students are aware of how external forces shape them, we shift the focus inward, asking them, who do you want to be? What kind of brother, friend, partner, father, when we get there, etc., do you want to be? So we encourage them to reflect on their own values, their own behaviours, their own aspirations. Instead of focusing on right or wrong ways to behave, we kind of guide students through a reflective process. Do your actions align with your personal values and aspirations? And so this approach shifts the responsibility to the individual, allowing them to explore their own choices and behaviours in a deeply personal way. And then finally, we get young people to redefine masculinity on their own terms. So we bring it all together by helping students reconcile societal expectations with their personal values. And often, traditional ideas of masculinity, like avoiding vulnerability, are in direct conflict with how students may want to express themselves. And so here we support them in redefining masculinity in a way that aligns with their authentic self. By breaking away from rigid norms, students are empowered to develop a healthier, more flexible view of gender that fits who they are, ultimately fostering better relationships, self-awareness, emotional well-being, etc. And so these 3 steps, awareness, empowerment, redefinition, work together to create a lasting impact, giving students the tools to navigate gender expectations while staying true to their values. And we've done just that over the last week with the students here at LVS Ascot. So some of the things that we've done, let's go back. We run our healthy masculinity workshops with years 7, 8, 9 and 10. So we've done today in boy-only groups. We're going to be working with LVS juniors as well in December, the years 5 and 6 there. And then we've also run our introduction to masculinity assemblies for years 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and 13 mixed gender groups. So part of the ethos as well is that everybody can be involved in promoting healthy masculinity. Everybody can play a part in redefining, reimagining what masculinity looks like, because it benefits all of us to do so. And so, how can we support the young people in our lives? How can you as parents support our children towards healthy masculinity? Well, the first step is self-reflection. It's building an awareness of our own gender-based ideas, how they impact our lives, and how they impact how we relate to our children. These ideas come through in the way that we relate to the young people in our lives and our children. So, for example, there's evidence to suggest that boys are not only held less, but in fact also spoken to less in their childhood, partly because of the ways that we relate to young children, based off of these gender ideas. So we need to just have a reflection on what are our assumptions about masculinity, gender, and how does that impact the way that we relate with our children, what impact might that be having, etc. And then it's important for us to have open, productive conversations about gender and their experiences with them. And so part of that as well is also about role modeling this reflection, role modeling this questioning, role modeling this authenticity as well. So, role modeling healthy masculinity, how can we do that? We are going to start running in the new year, in the springtime as well, sessions in workplaces for adults like ourselves to have this self-reflection, to have an awareness of how masculinity and how our ideas about gender are impacting our lives, and then how can we role model that for ourselves, for the other people in our lives, and for the children in our lives as well. And one further key aspect is a facilitator mindset. So by facilitator mindset, we mean when we're having conversations with young people about masculinity, how do we go about that? What approach do we bring to that? Well, some of the key factors in that are around holding the space, so being a stable presence in the room and being non-reactive. So for example, in the workshops, very, very often things come up like ideas of homophobia, ideas of misogyny, women should be this, women should be that. Students often kind of hushedly say the thing, and then when they realize that I'm not going to react to it, I'm just going to say, okay, interesting, let's explore that. Where does that idea come from? What might the impact of that idea be? Do we think that's beneficial? Do we think that's harmful? Being that stable presence that isn't going to necessarily react to things in a way that they might think helps to open up the conversation, where young people might be more willing to tell you what they're actually thinking rather than maybe what they think we want to hear. And so it's then also important to be open. That kind of furthers this openness, this curiosity, this space where they feel able to have the conversations in a way that is open and they're not going to be punished or anything like that for it. So seeing beyond as well, seeing beyond the assumption that a challenging statement equals a bad person or a bad child. It's about, where does that idea come from? Where have you picked that up from? What do you think the impact of that is? Can you see that this is harmful? Can you see, etc.? So it's about seeing beyond our kind of first assumptions. And obviously it can be quite alarming for the young person in our life, for the child in our life, to say something that we think is harmful. That can be very alarming. But being able to just have a moment of reflection and just have a moment of kind of, okay, where's that coming from? Why do you think that, etc., can be really, really beneficial. And then it's about allowing space so that boys can talk about their feelings and viewpoints, even if we might not agree. And then considering what's not being said. So sometimes they're not saying the things that they actually believe, and we want to be getting to those ideas about what they really think, etc. So young people want to have these conversations, right? They want to have these conversations with us. They maybe not necessarily with their parents, particularly an adolescent, but they want to be having these conversations with each other, with other people in their lives. And so we need to provide the space, the open, curious, empathetic space for them to be able to have those conversations. And then offering different perspectives and guidance. So can you see why that's harmful? Can you see what the impact of that attitude or behaviour might be? Okay, what do we want to replace that with? Where have we got that from? Let's not look at those medias anymore, these sorts of things. So we're still nudging them towards what's beneficial, but it's about what's beneficial for their well-being, their relational well-being, their mental health, etc. And so that's the sort of overview of our work at Voicebox. That's the overview of our approach. That's the overview of kind of how you guys can help help continue the conversations that we've had with our young people over this last week at LVS Ascot. If you'd like some more information, that QR code will take you to our website. If you'd like to get in touch, my email is fredi@voiceboxcic.com. If you're interested in further resources as well, I highly recommend a man called Richard Reeves, who's done a huge amount of work on men, masculinities, etc. His book is absolutely brilliant, of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, What to Do About It. It's a really, really brilliant book. He's also done a brilliant Diary of a CEO podcast recently, which lays it all out in a really nice way as well. Bell Hooks, The Will to Change is a wonderful book. I mean, I read it years ago and it had me in tears through most of the book. It's a very in-depth look at the cost of unhealthy masculinity, the cost of traditional masculinity, and what it does to young boys to have to try and live up to this throughout their lives. Then Matt Pinkett, Boys Don't Try, is also about kind of masculinity in schools and boys' approach to education. Grayson Perry's Descent of Man is a really good introduction into ideas of masculinity, what those ideas are, what are the kind of things that are in our sort of cultural brains about masculinity. And then Terence Real, I don't want to talk about it, is about male mental health, male depression. It's a little bit of a sort of therapy textbook, kind of, but it's also incredibly insightful in terms of the ways that male distress, male depression can crop up in life and for lots of men. So those are sort of resources I recommend. As mentioned, if you want to talk about this anymore, you want to get in touch, then please do get in touch. Our website is there. Yeah.
Thank you, Fredi. It's
problem.
such a huge topic, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's complex as well.
It's very complex.
And
yeah.
you actually sit here with a heavy heart, don't you? I've got children myself. I've got two boys in there with a girl, and I must admit, I worry about the boys more than my daughter, which probably 20 or 30 years ago, I think parents might have been worried more about their daughters than their boys. Yeah. And I think having been born in the 60s and grown up in the 70s, I can see that shift and how society has changed as well. I mean, you've got some comments on there, but before we have a look at those, what made you start Voicebox?
Yeah, so I set it up with three other, essentially just some of my closest pals from uni. We all went to uni together. We did a course on applied theatre, which is sort of the use of workshops and theatre for education, social aims, etc. And off the back of some of the lectures that we did on sort of feminism and gender equality, we realised that process of reflecting on and reimagining the rules for men hadn't happened at the same rate, or hadn't really started happening hadn't happened yet. Hadn't happened for us. We hadn't experienced it, and so we realised that we maybe had the skills and maybe also the understanding of gender and gender ideas and gender stereotypes to do something about that. And then that sort of led us to set it up in 2019. Most of us wrote about it within our kind of dissertations. One of my other colleagues and I have both done postgraduate degrees where we look at masculinity and mental health and those sorts of things. So it was an awareness that we would have benefited massively from it as a young person at school. I massively would have done. The reason I'm involved in this is the sort of mental health element of it. I come from a family with various mental health issues. I've had mental health issues my whole life, and my masculinity has definitely been a barrier in that sense. I was also a very angry, unhealthily masculine teenager. I would have massively benefited from some of this work. I maybe wouldn't have enjoyed the sessions very much. I might have not engaged, but I definitely would have benefited from it. So it was that awareness that this was something that needed to happen for young people, and for everybody, not just young people, but there was something that needed to happen, and that there weren't that many people doing the work. And so 5.5 years ago we set it up, and as they say, the rest is history, and now we're here. Yeah.
I mean, it's happened so quickly when you think about it, hasn't it? And as you say, we've not had time to kind of catch up with it, and you can see the pressures that young men, and not so young men are, facing at the moment as well. Yeah. And when you're talking about depression as well, and you hear about different types of therapies like CBT and other kinds of therapies. Yeah. Is there a specific sort of like advice about how you seek assistance if you think this is the root of possibly how sad you're feeling or how depressed? Yeah,
so in terms of are there ways to make it easier for men to seek help with therapy? Is that so I think some of the issues with the kind of men and mental health stuff is that there is a bit of an issue with men not opening up. But it's not as much of an issue as we think it is. Most people who end up taking their lives have been in contact with services at some point. They have asked for help at some point. What a lot of men tend to talk about is that flip side of these ideas, the flip side of us expecting men and boys to be tough, strong, unemotional, is that when we're faced with them not living up to that, we might react poorly to that if we haven't done our own process of self-reflection. Just subconsciously, we might react poorly to that. So there is lots of cases of young men and men going to GPs and doctors and their mental distress being responded to differently and maybe in not so much of a helpful way. So I think in terms of the kind of different therapies and therapists, the most important thing for therapy to be effective is finding a therapist you connect with. That's the single most important thing, is the relationship you have with that person is the most important thing. The kind of models, things like that, don't necessarily, they're not as important as that relationship. CBT is obviously, I've done kind of various different types of therapies. CBT has been massively beneficial for my anxiety. It's massively helped me with that.
Fantastic.
So anxiety and depression, CBT can be incredibly helpful. For things that are slightly more to do with maybe the way you relate to people, relationships, those sorts of things, other types of therapies might be more beneficial. But there are lots of therapists out there now who are focusing on, who kind of say, you know, working with men and specifically men on these issues. It's becoming more of a focus, particularly within the mental health field. But there's now starting to be a case for a approach to engaging men in physical health and mental health as well, a kind of model that understands the way that men experience these issues, basically. So, sort of answering the question.
Is it hard to bring men together to talk together?
No.
No.
There's lots of organisations that do it. So there's things like men's sheds. There's kind of people that do things in the woods with kind of rituals and things like that. One of the key things about the way that men like relating to each other is that we prefer side to side rather than face to face. So we prefer doing things like fishing or woodworking, and it's actually it also really helps with, say, teenagers. Is the drive to school is probably the best point in the day to talk to a teenager because it's side to side. It's not face to face. So men often prefer doing the side-to-side stuff. It's why I think men, you know, the sports clubs, all of those things are really important areas for embedding a lot of these conversations to happen. So I'm part of a rugby team in Clapham where I live, and some of the conversations I've had with the people in that team have been, you know, they've people who've been through the most tremendous difficulties and suffering and all this stuff. But that environment is one where just the act of kind of hanging out with a bunch of other men of our age can be really beneficial. I think taking the step from men together in a room doing something to men together in a room doing something and talking about mental health and vulnerabilities and those things, that can sometimes be a bit difficult. But I think that that's not to say that loneliness also isn't a massive problem, but I think by and large my experience is that there is a massive appetite for men to talk about these issues with each other, with other people, talk about masculinity, talk about their mental health. We just have to work out and help them open up about it, open that avenue, and then listen. And then there is whenever, it's always a point if I'm not drinking and say it's a rugby social and everybody else is drinking, there comes a point in the night where everybody starts talking. Everybody really starts talking about things. And that point in the night is really interesting because then you actually have conversations with people that they haven't had with anybody for 3 months, and suddenly at that point they are actually talking to you about it. So, yes and no. Actually, it can be difficult, but yeah.
And I suppose it's about understanding as well, because I've been a teacher for a long time and a mum for a long time, and yet I've learnt things from you today about this side, or about the talking, about the doing, and it's understanding, isn't it? Understanding. You guys, you know, and I'm saying you guys, understanding you, you know, because that's so important as well. You know, and looking at some of those clips as well, I mean, that is bullying, isn't it? Just it's bullying, full stop. And I suppose that just doesn't help, does it? You know, you've got all of this social media. Those clips were disgraceful. You know, if that had been one of my children or my acquaintances, I would have been furious to see that kind of content. And that is so damaging.
Yeah, exactly, and it's part of the theory. It's one of the things that Bell Hooks' book is so wonderful at articulating, is that and actually Terence Real as well, that the process of becoming a stereotypical man in our society is in and of itself incredibly harmful. A process of having to be tough, not show emotions, not show vulnerability, Bell Hooks calls it she calls it the normalized traumatization of young boys into masculinity. The process of having to live up to these things is in and of itself quite harmful.
Yeah.
And the way that it reproduces, so the way that young people reproduce it for each other is often through bullying. And we always ask in the workshops, what happens if somebody doesn't live up to these rules? The answer is always they'll be shamed, they'll be bullied, they'll be ostracized, they'll be, mocked, all these sorts of things. So that process of keeping us all in these boxes is in and of itself a harmful process, and it is bullying, basically. And bullying is massively interwoven with it. Yeah.
You've got some lovely comments here as well. So we've got Sarah there saying it's about empathy, isn't it? And role models.
Yeah.
So important as well, isn't it?
Definitely. And often young people find it difficult to find those role models. So if we can help them actually, articulate who are those positive role models, who might be better, from my point of view, there's a man called Jordan Stevens who's from Rizzle Kicks. There's a lot of work on this masculinity stuff, and he's a brilliant role model. Someone like Marcus Rashford, great role model. There are Hugh Jackman actually has been really interesting recently, talking about kind of vulnerability and anxiety. Ryan Reynolds talking about his anxiety. Where are these role models? They're there. They're just not as attractive or easy to pick out always from the crowd. Boy Mum as well, I've heard really good things about. Yeah, definitely. That's a great book. Liz Plank, also good one for the love of men. She's got a great podcast called, I think it's just the Being a Man podcast, but she's got a brilliant podcast as well that she does with Justin Baldoni, which is really brilliant. It's a really, really great podcast about manhood. And on Instagram every week she does a post of For the Love of Men, which is basically clips of men being wonderful to each other and to other people. It's really nice.
What sort of things do the children come up with in the sessions? Were there some interesting things that stood out, or are you seeing sort of common themes wherever you go?
Oh, there are lots of common. I mean, the common themes are around strength, toughness, dominance, not having emotional vulnerability. So we're always kind of tinkering with the workshops to kind of optimize them. We used to run an exercise where we would ask them to basically say, is it okay for you to feel sad? And they'd go, yeah, it's a natural human emotion. And you go, okay, what about crying? They go, no, not crying. So the demonstration of that, no, that's not okay. But feeling it, maybe yes, but showing it, no. So that showing of any kind of vulnerability. Some of the kind of cardinal sins of masculinity are essentially showing vulnerability and not being tough. Being feminine in any way. Anything that smells of femininity to boys, that's just the worst thing to do. Big ideas of homophobia as well within there, not being gay, those are big ideas. But the big ideas around being tough, being not feminine, and being not gay are some of the big ideas. And then you have some lovely things sometimes coming through, like, being loyal and those sorts of things. There's not only negatives, but I think those are the big ones. It's toughness, and the kind of self-reliance as well is a big one, and not asking for help, and that's linked to the mental health stuff. And so there are broad commonalities, and that's from the sociological kind of studies, but also from our own work as well, that it maps onto those things as well. There's a big 7 that I always forget what they are. Anyway, those are some of the big ones,
And I suppose you could probably see children probably thinking, reflecting, and a comment there about, maybe it might not be the right time or place right now to have taken this on board, but it won't go, it will always be there, won't it?
Yeah, it's about planting the seeds,
And hopefully open up some conversations at home as well.
Definitely.
Because, I mean, as human beings, we can be pretty awful to each other, can't we? The best of times, and it's just about, that empathy, the love, support, and being kind.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
Exactly, and I think it's the real, if we're really getting into it, the real harm of masculinity is that it basically, because we're telling men to be tough, it's telling our society that maybe we don't need love, and that's just complete rubbish.
Everybody needs love, don't they?
But that's part of the problem is that we, that whole thing about boys being held less, talked to less, boys being touched less in their childhoods. That is going to have an impact on people. That is going to have an impact on people. Touch deprivation is a big problem for lots of people, particularly older men. And they call it skin hunger, which sounds terrifying. It's just an awful phrase. But so there are all of these ways in which it's.
Are there cultural differences as well? Because obviously in some cultures the expectations are even higher, aren't they? Do you see that a lot in different cultures?
There are cultural differences. Well, in some places in the Middle East, 2 men holding hands is absolutely fine. Here, not so much. That would be seen in a different light. So there are cultural differences, and that's part of the sort of theory part of the practice of it is that because there are cultural differences, these aren't just facts. They're things that can change, and therefore we can change them for the better.
Yeah.
There are cultural differences. I mean, we work a lot. We do a lot of work in kind of London, in different areas of London, Tower Hamlets, Harrow. Sort of, we've done some work in Merton at the minute as well. And there are lots of different cultural differences within that, and particularly in terms of the role of women as well. There can be cultural differences there. And those conversations was very interesting. Navigating those, whenever I'm having the conversation, I always come back to, look, if your marriage relationship falls into the slightly more conservative lines of you being the breadwinner, her staying at home, being domestic, if that's a conversation that you've had and everybody's happy with it, that's not a problem.
No.
It's when it's imposed and it's oppressive and somebody's actually unhappy and doesn't want to do that, that's when it becomes a problem. So if you're having the conversation, you're having the openness, and there's the option and the flexibility, and it's not so much a problem. And then also schools are always coming back to sort of British values, those sorts of things as well. But yeah, there are some good cultural differences, you know.
And do you see that reflected in, because, you know, suicide, you know, just facing this head on, 75% male.
Yeah.
Is that affected by culture? Can you see, does it affect certain people differently? I mean, is there...
I don't know. I don't know about the cultural differences.
Yeah.
I mean, anecdotally, I know that certain cultures say, you know, I know that Japan has quite a big problem with suicide, and that's probably linked to things with shame and those sorts of things. I don't really know in terms of the kind of cultural differences with suicide. I don't really know. Well, one of the things I do know about suicide is that the suicide attempts aren't necessarily 75%. They don't necessarily track onto the completed suicide rates. One of the things that happens is, again, these gender stereotypes come in. One of the big gender stereotypes is about men being acceptant of violence and aggression, right? You know, who goes and fights the wars? It's the men, you know, who does those things, etc. The flip side of that is that men tend to use more violent methods when attempting suicide, and therefore complete suicide more likely to be, because they use more violent methods on themselves, etc. So, in terms of the kind of cultural differences with that, I don't know enough about it really.
No.
Yeah.
But it's, as I say, it's a vast topic, isn't it? And
massive,
you know, if you've got any parting advice for our parents out there, what is it?
Parting advice. I think it's do the work yourself.
Yeah.
It's do the work yourself. It's understand this yourself, and particularly as fathers, I think it's incredibly important to have reflected on your own ideas of masculinity, your own ideas of what you think a man should be, because that will come out subconsciously just in the way that you relate to your children. So I think it's about doing the work yourself and role modelling positive interactions, role modelling positive, an awareness of gender stereotypes, basically. It's an awareness of how these things impact my behaviours, my attitudes, and actually thinking, is that the best thing for me or not? Because that's what they'll take onwards.
Because I suppose there's, you know, with men of a particular age as well, older men who have been raised or are raised with that stereotype, it's probably going to be very hard for them to let go of that baggage, so to speak, isn't it? To try and understand what their sons are going through. Yeah,
it is difficult. I think also men of that generation, statistically, their generation is the most likely to also suffer from the suicide stuff. So I think they're also being faced with these problems. And you know, I know a lot of the men in my dad's social circle. He's now nearly 60. I think nearly 60. Might even be his birthday tomorrow. In fact, actually, I remember that. A lot of men in his social circle have had to. Often for them, when they reflect on this is when things get bad. So when they have a heart problem because they don't look after themselves, or they've been drinking too much, and that gets to a point where their health gives out, or their mental health gives out. That's when they actually take a moment and start to reflect on these things. But there is definitely, I think, an appetite for it. You know, I've had a lot of these conversations with my dad. In fact, we're planning a little parent session on how to parent adolescent boys together, which I think would be good. But yeah, I think men of that generation, there's definitely an appetite, and I think it is impacting them. They may not necessarily have the resources to do it, and that's part of what we want to start doing, is providing those resources as well.
It's having the confidence and the bravery, really, to have those conversations, isn't it? Because I suppose we all, you know, you probably don't know you're on uncharted territory, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah.
You're in the open water.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's no guidance there.
And one of the things that I always find is when one person opens the door,
Yeah.
often with all this stuff, everybody else follows.
Yeah.
So when I remember when I first started talking about this stuff, first started talking about my mental health, I had conversations with some of my friends who I thought were absolutely fine, had no problems whatsoever.
Yeah.
I opened the door and everybody else followed. I
Absolutely.
haven't done it now because I've been so busy, but I used to have my nails painted. And as soon as I started doing that, other people in my friendship group
Really?
started coming through and doing it
Brilliant.
as well. So they went, oh, why not? What's the point?
Yeah.
So I think often that first person having the bravery to challenge these things
Yeah.
often gives everybody, in fact, always gives everybody else the permission to do it as well. And
Yeah.
that's one of the most important things, is that it needs that first person to go, no, I'm not going to keep doing this just because it's the way we've always done it. I'm going to actually do something differently. And then everybody goes, oh, that looks quite good. I might go over there and do that with him. Yeah, I might do that because that's better for me. And so, yeah, having the bravery to be the first person to open that door, particularly in your sort of peer groups, I think is often very important.
It's
Yeah.
been so interesting talking to you today.
Yeah, thank you.
And I know that Laura, our DSL, you've met Laura today
Yes.
as well. She's listening as well. So, and no doubt we'll have a good chat about this afterwards and
Yeah.
see what the next steps are for us. And,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
know, and we want to thank you for coming in.
No, thank you for
Talking
having
very
us.
openly,
Yeah.
and obviously you've had some great comments in there
Yeah.
as well. And there's probably a few people out there who haven't said it, but are
Yeah.
probably thinking that it's brilliant. So thank
Yeah.
you very much.
No,
And,
thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, and so thank you, parents. And
Yeah.
if you've got any questions or you want any kind of follow-up, then you know how to contact Fredi.
Yeah.
And you know how to contact me.
Yeah.
Okay, have a lovely
Brilliant.
weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.